Whether your team is your family, your business, or your employees, staying connected is crucial. You can depend on the Cross Insurance family
Very good.
to provide the best insurance solutions for you. We've got your team protected. Visit crossagency.com today.
Hello, and welcome to the GlobeDocs discussion of the film Earth Emergency. My name is Sabrina Shankman, and I report on climate change for the Globe. I am delighted to be joined now by the filmmakers of Earth Emergency, Bonnie Walsh and Susan Gray. Thank you both so much for joining us. So glad to have you here. Before we dive into the discussion of the film, I want to just give everyone watching a heads up that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to drop any questions that you've got in there. We'll be talking for a while, and then I'll be opening it up to the questions, and I will do my very best to get to those that you submit. So with that, Bonnie and Susan, I am so glad to chat with you about this. Climate tipping points happens to be something that I, as a climate journalist, have been fascinated by for years, and I'm so curious why you chose to zero in on this, because there's a lot of talk about climate change. There is not a lot of talk about tipping points, at least in media that's out there. So, Bonnie, why don't you take that?
Hi, thanks for having us, Sabrina. So we actually were approached by a filmmaker who had this idea to do a film about feedback loops and tipping points. And he said he'd been talking to a lot of friends and he'd been hearing a lot about feedback loops, and a lot of people, even really well-educated people that he knew, did not know what feedback loops are. They hadn't heard about them. And so he wanted to get the message out to inform the public about what feedback loops and tipping points are. And it turned out that this is something that Greta Thunberg had also been talking about, these chain reactions or tipping points. So he came to us with the charge to get the message out. And so that's why we ended up looking at it through that particular lens of feedback loops and tipping points. And it really hadn't been done before.
No, it hadn't. Susan, why is it in your mind that this matters? Why is this the story to be telling about climate change right now?
Well, I'd say two things. I'd say the reason that these films have actually gotten out there, because when Barry came to us, our feeling was there are a million climate change films. It's not an area you can get into. And what we found was there are sort of two things this film does that other films hadn't done. And we started with 5 short little films for the web. And from there, it just grew. And we realized we really have tapped into something. This first was the idea of going back to science. It's become so politicized, and so many of the films out there deal with the hardship on people as they lose their homes and the results of climate change. But we all think we know what's going on with the climate change, but we don't. And I thought I knew. I was a geology major in college. I thought I knew. I didn't. And the more that we studied this, the scarier it got. What's happening is the Earth itself is weighing in. So as the temperature rises, we can stop putting carbon in tomorrow, but the Earth has her own natural reaction to this. And that's what these feedback loops are. And they're not being taken into the model. So to understand, you have to go back and say, okay, so how does the Earth work? And we end up in this film. It's a basic science lesson. We're telling you, okay, how does a tree transpire? And how does a tree take carbon out of the air? And what's a heat trapping gas? What's permafrost? What's the jet stream? Just really basic. So all of us can empower ourselves to understand what the problem is. So that was the first thing. The second thing was to keep it really simple. Keep it on feedback loops. Don't go. We kept trying to do positive solutions and take the story farther. And Barry kept saying, no, it's about feedback loops and understanding what they are and tipping points. And, and ultimately we talk about, well, can you actually reverse them and get them to start cooling the planet and start amplifying? And I think the answer is yes, but we got a long way to go. But the other thing I think for me, the big takeaway after working on this for a few years is that nobody talks about the Earth, and it's the Earth that's going to solve our problem. There's a lot of talk right now about technology being, sucking heat trapping gases out of the air. And, all the climate scientists will tell you, no, it's trees that are going to make the difference. It's the earth herself that's going to make the difference. And we can let her do her job. We'll be okay, but we have to understand what that job is and understand how to let her do it. So that's the goal of these films.
What's interesting to me is that, as you said, you described it very simply. In the film, you can sit and you can read it, watch it, and really understand the science. But as someone who has read the journal articles as they've come out over the last 10 years, I know very well that it's not simple at all. It's actually quite complicated. So I'm curious how you went about taking something so complicated and really making it palatable and viewable for people. That's a big job. So Bonnie, you want to go ahead with that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, once we were charged with this idea of focusing on feedback loops, we went ahead and did, months of research to really find out what the biggest feedback loops were. And we ended up landing on the 4 major areas, which are forests, permafrost, albedo, which is the reflection in the North Pole, and atmosphere, which includes the jet stream and water vapor, and an introductory film, kind of introducing people to the idea of feedback loops. And another thing Greta always says is listen to the scientists. The scientists know what's going on. Don't listen to me, listen to them. So in order to do that, we got a special lens that allowed the scientists to look at us through the lens. Typical documentary style is the subject looks a little off camera at the interviewer, but in this case, we wanted them to look right into the lens, talk to the audience, tell them exactly what's going on in as simple terms as possible. We also we wanted to have the graphics do a lot of the heavy lifting, and so we really worked hard on making the graphics very clear. We wanted to keep repeating this idea of a feedback loop, so we have this graphic that appears over and over again in the film, hammering in the point of this vicious circle that amplifies warming more and more. We also wanted to illustrate the carbon and the methane bubbles coming out of the permafrost. And so we really focused a lot on the graphics. So I guess that, those things, the scientists looking in the lens, the graphics, the really having the scientists do as simple explanations as possible. That's what we really focused, so that people would come away understanding what's really going on.
So for those who may not have seen the film just yet, I'm wondering, maybe Susan, could you give a quick explanation, and Bonnie touched on it, but what is a feedback loop? Maybe pick an example of among the 4 that you feature. What is it?
Yeah, so a feedback loop is a self-amplifying loop. It's a process. There's an input, and that input kicks off a process, and that process is like a snowball rolling down the hill. It keeps building and keeps feeding on itself, and it builds more, and it reaches a point where there's no turning back. And each of the different feedback loops, we talk about that for atmosphere, for permafrost, for the melting of the ice caps, for the forests. They're all reaching their own tipping points. Forests now suck carbon out of the air, but they're turning to the point where now they're emitting carbon. And you get to a point where the forests themselves are emitting carbon. You've hit a tipping point and a point of no return. And scientists all disagree where those points are, but they know they're out there. They talk about it as driving the fog and knowing there's a cliff. Do you want to be going 100 miles an hour towards that cliff, or do you want to be going 2 miles an hour towards that cliff?
I wrote that quote down when I watched the film. It was so poignant.
Yeah. And they all use it. That's a very common, but it's a great analogy. And, the one that everybody points out is the most obvious is permafrost. And permafrost has been storing carbon, so dead animals and plants in the frozen Arctic tundra for tens of thousands of years. And it's sequestering carbon. It's taking it out of the air and locking it away. And what happens with these feedback loops is as it starts to melt, it starts to decompose. And as carbon and all this frozen remains decompose, they emit greenhouse gases, methane, which is 30 times more powerful than carbon, and carbon dioxide, which trap heat. And so as they trap heat, it becomes hotter. And as it becomes hotter, it melts more permafrost, and more heat trapping gases are released. And that's this self-perpetuating loop that's going in the warming direction.
Thanks. I remember when I first heard about this, it was in maybe 2015. It was after the IPCC report came out, which then led to the Paris Agreement. And I was speaking with a scientist who said, but you don't understand the scary projections that the IPCC report included doesn't take into account the thawing of the permafrost and the methane included in there, because not because of a mistake, but because the science wasn't there yet. I mean, this represents truly like the cutting edge of where science is developing every day. And I'm curious how you go about doing your work when the ball is moving as you're trying to tell the story. I mean, did you find yourself having to make edits as scientists were issuing new studies, or was it a little less chaotic than I'm imagining it?
We're more big picture than that. You know, we're not in the detail nitty gritty right in there doing it. And scientists have known for a long time, the trends. The problem with scientists is they don't want to commit to anything, right? They're not going to give you numbers and projections and all of that. And at a certain point, you know, we had made the film following the scientists, listening to the scientists, and there weren't big conclusions being drawn. So we had to go back and sort of put in the larger conclusions, because you need them. I mean, for the lay audience to understand what it all means, you have to have some kind of a context. And how many years are we talking? Are we talking 10,000 years from now? Are we talking tomorrow? You know, you need some kind of framework in there. And so our job was to talk to enough people to get sort of a rough idea of what those contexts and frameworks were, and then to include them in the film to make it more understandable.
Sure. And among those whose voices you used to help do that, I had some pretty big names in there. Bonnie, will you talk a little bit about the launch of the film?
Oh, yeah. So as Susan mentioned, we began with 5 short films for the web. And they were finished in fall of 2020. And through our producer, Barry Hershey, we were able to work with the Mind and Life Institute to get the Dalai Lama to be part of our launch. We had a virtual launch in January of 2021. And because we got the Dalai Lama, we ended up being able to get Greta Thunberg also. They had never met each other. The Dalai Lama had written a letter to her in the introduction to a book he had just come out with about climate change, and they each wanted to meet each other. And so once we had one signed on, we got the other, and they both agreed to be on this virtual panel. So we had this incredible event with one of the scientists from our film, Sunatali, and one of our advisors, William Muma, and the Dalai Lama and Greta. And we showed 3 clips of the film, and we had over 1 million viewers from around the world watch. So it was really exciting.
Yeah, I'll say. So this fall, since we're talking big picture stuff, we had all these world leaders meeting in Glasgow for all this very well publicized talks to come up with a pretty tepid climate agreement. I'm curious, for the two of you having lived in this space for quite a while now, if you had been given the floor and could have said something to the world leaders at the COP this fall, what would you have said? What's the message you would have liked to have delivered?
Well, I'm going to let Susan take this one, but I just want to tell you that we were at COP. We were
great.
His Royal Highness Prince Charles to show the film there. And so Susan and I went to Glasgow, and in Susan's speech before we showed the film, she gave her message. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Susan.
Perfect.
I have so many messages, Bonnie. Where to even begin? I mean, the simple answer, and we're into simple, stop cutting down trees, period. You know, understand the way nature works and live in harmony with nature. Let nature do her job. And where to begin? I mean, take Massachusetts. Massachusetts has some of the most carbon dense forests in the entire Northeast. Are we protecting those forests and letting them do their job? You know, we're not. We're cutting them down, and we're going in the direction of biofuel in a lot of places. ExxonMobil just came out with their big announcement. They're going to be, you know, carbon neutral in their operations by 2050. And if you look at, this is the problem with knowing too much. if you look at what they're actually doing, so what are they going to do? So they're going to, they're not going to include any of burning of carbon or fossil fuels. That's like stage 4, and they don't include that in their projections. So that means that 90% of all the emissions from the polluting that they're doing in the business that they're doing doesn't get counted. So the amount of pollution that they put out, like methane wells, they need to cap methane wells so they don't emit methane, and using electricity themselves is coming from green resources. All of that's going to be carbon neutral by 2050. But the way that they're doing that is they're going to invent technology to suck carbon out of the air. Well, right now, technology sucks 0% of the carbon out of the air, and they're going to use biofuel to get there. This very green energy biofuel. Well, in fact, biofuel is probably the worst thing you can do to the environment. You know, it's taking out old trees that had sequestered carbon over hundreds of years. If you have 3% old trees in a forest, they take out 43% of all the carbon in that forest. So what you're doing is you're cutting down the old trees that have stored all this carbon, and then you're burning them, and you're putting all the carbon back into the air. And that's biofuel. And so they're doing exactly the opposite of what they need to do. What they need to do is to stop cutting down forests. And they need to protect the old growth forest that we have and the trees that we have. And that message is not getting out. Biden came out with his big, climate plan, and we got on the phone the next day with our scientists, and it's like, are you excited about everything that our new president is doing? And they were just crestfallen, and they said nothing's really happened. They said they're not talking. We didn't hear them mention, and somebody asked that question, and it was quickly tabled. So the most exciting thing that came out of Glasgow when we were there was not from the 190 governments and countries that participated. It was the private sector. And the day that we landed, they launched this new initiative by the global financial industry to retool our sector, that individuals have now pledged $190 trillion to retool off of fossil fuels and onto green energy or carbon neutral energy. And it was, Bonnie and I were just really happy to be with His Royal Highness, because he was part of this whole initiative. He'd spent 10 years launching this thing. So we felt like in the end, we were in the right place.
Yeah,
That's great.
I think it's 130 trillion.
Okay.
What did I say, 190?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, 130.
A lot. That's still a lot. So if they can really come together and do the work that needs to be done, that would be amazing.
Yeah. So in the climate communication world, I'm not sure if you've received this, but I sometimes get some flack for stories that I write for being too doomerist. The idea being that if you give too much of a dose of what could be, based on science, based on what the experts are saying, but that it can be so overwhelming, especially for an audience that might be coming fresh to climate change, that it can result in just apathy and overwhelm. And I'm curious if this is something that you have thought about or encountered with this work at all. Bonnie, why don't we throw this to you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as we were working on the films, we were worried about being too doom and gloom. And because we didn't want to talk about solutions, because we didn't want to dilute the topic of feedback loops by talking about solutions, we were really just focusing on the dire feedback loops. And it was pretty bleak at one point. And then we decided that we really needed to put in some bit of hope at the end, because you can. I mean, all the scientists we interviewed said, yes, we can stop it. It's not too late. They did have some optimism. So we wanted to include that at the end of the film and say, it's not too late. We could make it not as bad. We might be able to reverse some of these loops, so we can't just give up. So we tried to inject a little optimism in the end and a little hope that if we can come together, we could turn this ship around somehow. Yeah. But it's a tough message to.
And I would add to that things changed over the years that we were making it. I think when we started out, that was our big concern. But one of our main scientists, Jennifer Francis, said people want to hear it. You know, they really want to hear it, and people are starved to understand what's going on. And I think Greta, you know, when you see Greta's speech, she's furious. She's really angry, and she's showing the emotion that I think all of us, if you really look at the problem and really understand what's going on, feel. And our feeling over the course of making this was, let Greta talk. You know, we showed her anger in our film. We used clips of Greta. And in the end, she was the one who actually gave us our solution, which was all great movements have come from the people, grassroots movements, and it's up to the people to change things. And her solution is educate yourself. And, you know, we heard there were 1,200 people signed up for this webinar. We never, when we started this, we thought 1,200 people could stomach this stuff and want to know about it. Educate yourselves and then raise your voice. You know, say something, do something, go out and don't just vote for politicians, hold them accountable, get involved. When they're telling you, oh yeah, green energy, biofuel, you know, that's what we're promoting. Boris Johnson came out in favor of forests at COP. He said how great forests were. And then we found out the Brits are supporting their biofuel industry in North Carolina, where they're clear cutting our old growth forests to the tune of $2 billion a year because it's not economically viable. And, you know, you've got to go behind what they're saying, and you have to keep on top of them. And
Accountability.
ways to do that. I mean, we can talk accountability.
Well,
Speak
actually,
out, talk to your friends. I mean, talk to your neighbors. Say something.
Along these lines, we've gotten a couple of questions that have just come in over the course of this conversation so far, specifically around education and how this film that you've made can be used in education. Have you thought about that? Do you have plans for that?
Yeah. Oh, yes, we have big plans. Yep. So, so the 5 short films that we began with are up on a website. Maybe this could get out to everyone. It's called feedbackloopsclimate.com. And we encourage educators to use them. We've done an educational curriculum for grades 6 through 12 for science teachers. We also have discussion guides, and those are accessible to anyone who wants to use them. Our goal is to get the word out. Because it aired on PBS, PBS Education will be distributing the long film. So they'll make it accessible to teachers around the country. And we're still looking into a more global distribution strategy to get beyond the US. Did I forget anything, Susan?
And the Khan Academy is using,
Right.
yeah, Khan Academy is using them.
Yeah, for their AP
for
environmental
their
science.
club.
Very cool. That's great to
And
hear
we
about
also,
something.
yeah, we also brought on a British distributor who was watching these films. So let me just say this, we have broken the mold in what you're supposed to do when you make a film for television. We never thought this would get on television. You know, the mold for science films is pretty much the NOVA model, where you follow characters, you get your great characters and you follow their quest, and they're out doing science and get to know them over the course of the hour. And there's an arc over the course of the hour. We blew that totally to smithereens. We made 5 short little films. There's no arc over the entire thing. I mean, we don't follow scientists through the whole thing. We follow climate feedback loops, and that's our character. And that now is gone to a British distributor, saw the films. His daughter walked into the room when he was watching them and said, "Dad, this is what you need to be doing." She sat down and watched the whole thing. And he took it on, and now it's going all over the world. We've sold to Latin America, to Africa, to Europe.
France.
France, oh yeah.
Well, I don't want to dilute the conversation by talking about famous people, but I do want to make note of your narrator in this film. How did that come to be that Richard Gere became the voice of this film?
Didn't that work out well?
Yeah.
I think that actually helped us get the Dalai Lama too, because he and the Dalai Lama are very tight. Barry, who was the filmmaker, producer, philanthropist who had this idea to start with, knew him from the work that he'd done with the Dalai Lama. And we went, you know, there's a lot of debate. Here we go. What's the model of filmmaking these days? You know, old white guy narrating, even if it's Richard Gere, really, do you want to go there? And in the end, we ended up going with Richard Gere, and he was phenomenal. He volunteered a Sunday, spent all day with us. He's couldn't have picked a better tone and way of narrating. And he's very passionate about this issue. I mean, he's went on Morning Joe for us, advertising the PBS broadcast. And he turned out to be an excellent choice.
Yeah, people
Really
love
happy with him.
his conversational style. He really sounds like he's just chatting with you. We were so pleased with the delivery.
Yeah, it's great.
And he told us on Sunday before he did his read that he'd gotten up early to pray for the film and the project. And to this day, we think that's why this film has gone so far, because of his powerful prayers.
That's wonderful. We're going to open this up to some of the questions from the audience now. So we've gotten some questions about how to talk to others about the sense of urgency and how they can make a difference in their own communities. Bonnie, do you want to take this first?
Well, we asked every scientist we interviewed to tell us what they would say, what they think we should do. What can we do? And they all said, first of all, vote, hold your lawmakers accountable, and talk it up. Talk to your friends, have them watch these films, bring it up at dinner parties, just educate people. Everyone should be talking about it, be informed about what's happening, and hold their legislators accountable to making the right decisions. So that's what we heard.
Yeah, and we interviewed a lot of people about the films we showed. We had all these focus groups who watched the films and commented. And a lot of what we heard from the young people was, we don't want to be told anymore to turn out the lights and stop burning, gas. And they said, you guys made this problem. It's not whether I'm driving an electric car or not. It's the policies that are being put into place. And we don't want to hear about our individual sacrifice anymore. And we took that to heart. I think they're right. I mean, it's not the level of, okay, so if I save, then that's going to change things. We're way past that. We have to incentivize people to use electric cars. We have to have charging stations, what Biden's trying to do should be done. We have to put these policies in place. The other thing I would say is that there's an organization called the League of Conservation Voters, and they also have state leagues like the California League of Conservation Voters, and they keep voting tallies on everybody, how they're doing on the environment. And they put out publications where you can read what the issues are in your neighborhood or in your state. And then you can get involved by writing to your elected officials and keeping on top of them. And I think that's a really good place to start.
Yeah.
That's great. There was a question that came in that it's a little specific, but I'm curious if you have thoughts on it. Someone wrote that on a recent webinar from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they were talking about removing residual carbon dioxide from the atmosphere via oceanic uptake strategies. So different ways to, we're talking about natural solutions before, the forests being a primary one, but there is a lot of promise in the ocean as well. Is this something that you, looked into? And I'm curious, or this viewer wants to know if, it poses some realistic options.
Yeah,
Totally. Excellent question.
It's a really good question. We ended up not doing a film about the oceans because the feedback loop in the ocean was so complicated, and our scientific advisors really advised us that it would just be so complicated to get into feedback loops in the ocean. That doesn't mean that the ocean isn't incredibly important or for climate change. It absorbs 25% to 30% of carbon from the air. And I know that there's been a lot of work done with kelp farming, kelp beds, because kelp farms can pull a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So I know there's a lot of stuff about that, but it's a great idea. I hope we can ramp up to do that on a big scale, because I think that would solve a huge, a lot of problems.
And the other thing they say about kelp beds, this is what our scientists say, is that it could take a forest 100 years to grow to a point where it's removing a lot of carbon, but it'll take a kelp bed 10 years. So it's a really wonderful place to be farming carbon.
Yeah, it's an interesting question in Massachusetts too, where we've got, I think, a lot of promise in that potentially developed, to be developed. So Okay, I'm gonna ask my own question here. How have you two personally, how has the act of doing this film changed you?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I first, I'll jump in first, Susan. When I first started researching the feedback loops, and I was sort of like a typical person where I'd heard about climate change, but I hadn't really studied it or researched it intensively. I really went through a period of sort of feeling very, very depressed about the state of the world. I was like talking to my kids saying, I don't know if you should have children. There are going to be so many climate refugees out there. We're going to need homes. We've got to limit the population growth. I, put solar panels on my house. I bought a hybrid car. I felt like I needed to do whatever I could do at, on an individual level. But it really threw me. It really brought me down, and it made me very cynical. And I have to say, I'm still feeling pretty cynical in terms of solutions and whether the world can really come together and do what has to get done.
How about you, Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I started out as a geologist, and I remember I was an environmental activist. I left college and went straight to doing environmental activism. And I remember sitting in class and learning about the stupid things that man does, like sucking out the water out of aquifers. And when that happens, if you suck out the water, the aquifers collapse and the living desert will then become a dry desert. And I went off to California to work in water issues. And, you think at the time that if you just get the word out there and educate everybody, people will do the right thing. And I went on to cover other things with journalism, and you come back and you'll learn that they haven't, that there's been a whole counter effort campaign to disinform people, and nobody knows what to believe. And look where we are all these years later. And so it's gotten me back into it, which for me has been really a big gift. But I would say it's also made me a little bit hopeful. I mean, we just made these little films thinking, well, few people would see them on the internet. And to see that you really can make a difference, and that so many people now, I mean, our goal was all the scientists know about feedback loops and they stay up at night worrying about them. The lay public doesn't even know what they are. So our simple goal was, let's bridge that gap and let as many of the lay public know what they are as possible and how little time we have once you understand it. And I think that we've done a lot towards making that happen.
Especially when you think about you talked about all the myriad ways in which this can be introduced, used as an educational tool. And I think when you start getting into classrooms, there's such vast potential for talking to the people who really matter, those who are a lot younger than us.
All you can do is hope that once all these people really understand it and know about it, maybe there will be this huge movement, this huge swelling of activism, and the corporations and governments will have to listen.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the hope.
Yeah. And we were in sync. We were in sync with all of that. I mean, we were in sync with what Greta was saying. We were in sync with what the Dalai Lama was saying. Mm-hmm. We were in sync with what was going on in Glasgow. I mean, we've all sort of come together in a moment. And the Dalai Lama talks about that. There's 7.8 billion people on this planet, and that's our new family. We have to think in terms of that being our family. And it feels that way. I mean, it feels like at some level, people are beginning to understand that. We share the atmosphere.
Yeah. Here's a question. And this sort of goes back to what you were talking about, that you were kind of took so much hope from in Glasgow, but how should and can corporations hold themselves accountable? And I'll add to that and say, or how can they be held accountable by us, would you say, if they're not doing it themselves?
I'm back to my educate yourself. I mean, forests take out 30% of all the carbon that we put into the air every year. Technology takes out 0. Bill Gates is getting a lot of press for what he's planning on doing, with his climate change initiative, which is to build technology that's going to take it out of the air. And by the time he does, it's going to be too late. So I think if everybody can just start really pushing politicians and corporations to get real about the solutions, I think that's the best that we can do. And right now, the corporations that this $130 trillion, they're saying, well, but they can't really divest from any big fossil fuel or oil companies that are in the major indexes that can't be done right now. They're not going to pull out of the major indexes for their investors. But they're saying that going forward, we won't invest with our money in the future. And I think that's really hopeful. Don't invest in areas that educate yourself so you know what those areas are that are harmful to the planet. We've only got one planet.
Yeah, I mean, I know in the.
But I also want to. Oh, go ahead. But I just want to say the films that we have on the web are translated into 25 different languages. So anybody who goes up, and the Dalai Lama then had 1 million people attend, and we started getting people coming from all over the world asking us to use these for educational purposes, and how could we please translate them into their language? And so I think we've already made a lot of difference, and still are, from those short little films.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to add that I know there was a big campaign to try to save the Amazon deforestation by boycotting certain food that was, agricultural industry that was responsible for clearing the land for their agriculture. And I know there was a big boycott in Europe of this specific brand of soybeans that was doing that, and it was very effective. So if there was at some point where we could actually do a boycott of certain corporations that weren't doing what they should be doing, then I would be a big proponent of that. At this point, obviously, we can't boycott using gas when we don't have, electric cars subsidized for us. It's not, it's hard for everyone to get one. But if we could do something like that, where the government is actually behind us supporting the change to renewable energy, that would be a great thing.
Yeah. I'm curious.
Our scientist, Bill Muma, I'm sorry, just to finish that. Scientist Bill Muma, who's our advisor for all of this, I know what he would say. I mean, he would say, stop pointing the finger towards the Amazon. Most of the carbon is in the boreal forests and the temperate forests, and that's our own backyard. And the greatest hope for the planet right now is in the temperate forests. So start looking around home in Massachusetts and what we're doing in this state, if you want to really make a difference.
Yeah. So this is a question about a different kind of technological solution than, carbon capture and sequestration. One of the viewers now wants to know if, given the risks that these tipping points pose, what your thoughts are and whether we should be researching or maybe preparing to be more ready, even regrettably, for things like geoengineering and solar radiation management. So at what point do you think, if ever, should human technology intervene to try to stop or slow or reverse one of these tipping points?
It's a good question.
Want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
You got to do it all. You can't just not, do one, not the other. It's not just forests, and it's not just kelp beds. Really, at this point, we've got to do it all. The problem with geoengineering, okay, figure out a way to suck carbon out and capture it and lock it away underground. But once you start seeding the atmosphere or seeding the oceans to get them to be reflecting back, it has all these ramifications that we just don't understand. We say the scientists don't know enough about feedback loops in the earth because they haven't had enough time to study it. Well, they certainly haven't had enough time to see what the consequences of those kinds of interventions are. So I think we have to be very careful about how we go about it, and who regulates it. Right now, it's billionaires who go out and do it on their own because they can pay for it. And there's got to be some board or science or some way of regulating it, it affects us all.
And right now the technology isn't there. It doesn't exist. We don't have the means to capture carbon from the atmosphere on any kind of large scale, endeavor. Right. It doesn't exist.
No.
So we're winding down.
Not scalable.
It's right. There are plenty of test projects that are out there and small scale projects. It's just incredibly expensive as well.
Right. You can do it globally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Indications seem to be that any carbon capture and sequestration in the near term will just be for the continued use of burning of fossil fuels, not for dealing with all those other atoms of carbon that are out there. So we only have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask you a question, but if as climate filmmakers, this is a question that you would like to hit the veto button on, we won't answer it. And here's why I'm saying that. What did you think of the movie Don't Look Up?
Good question.
Okay.
Okay, you go first, Susan.
I loved it. I mean, I thought the timing was perfect. It was so clear they were talking about climate change. Okay, it was over the top, but it was such a reflection of our society. I mean, it was such a great plot that they are terrified of how they're going to break this horrible news to the planet. And when they break the horrible news to the planet, all anybody wants to talk about are the polls. So 4% don't believe it's true, 35% believe. And it was really a great reflection of where we're at. I don't care if it was corny, over the top, whether you liked it or not. To me, it was very effective satire on the situation we're in with climate change. And it came out right before our film went on PBS. So for us, the timing was impeccable.
That's pretty great. Yeah.
I agree. I think it's a good metaphor, except for the fact that it's already happening. It's already happening. And it's like the frog in the boiling water. It's happening. We're all getting used to it. It's not like a cataclysmic event that's going to wipe out all species in 5 minutes. It's already going on. And so we have to wake up to that fact. But I think the way it portrayed the media, spinning it, and it was great. I thought it was very funny, even though it was very much on the nose.
Devastating. I laughed and laughed, and then I cried my eyes out, not expecting to be hit in that way by it. But it hits hard.
Really? That's great.
It hit hard. Well, we do have a few minutes, so I will ask you one more question to each of you. We talked about the despair of working on this issue, and I know that feeling. I think that's why I had that reaction to Don't Look Up. But I have moments every day that give me hope too. And I'm curious if we could end this maybe on a feeling, on a note of that. And if you could each kind of give me an example of maybe if you have like a specific one even of a time in this process that you walked away feeling hopeful. Bonnie, you want to go first, and then we'll give Susan the last word?
Yeah, I have to think about that for a minute though. So
Susan, do you have one? Do you want to go first?
Well, I've mentioned a couple, but I would say when we were really hard to get programs on television, and we had done a lot of debate about, do we make a 1 hour? Do we leave it with our 5 short films? And went back and forth and realized that a lot of the people in the world where they're cutting down their forests and where climate change really is affecting them are countries where they get their information from television, and they're only going to get it really from 1 hour programs that go on their public television, and we have to get this program out to the world. But it's like I said, it's not the kind of show, it doesn't follow the usual television format. It's very scientific. And so we went to this science congress, and we talked to a lot of different distributors and from all over the world, and everybody thought, oh, interesting, Dalai Lama, Greta Thunberg, yeah, you should talk to this person, that person. And then this British guy, Carl Hall, came on, and he just listened to each of the things that we said. We've got 5 short ones, we're making it until 1 hour, we've got Dalai Lama, Greta, Richard, his eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then he went off, came back, and told us that his daughter, he had made nature programs for 600 he had made in his life. And he said, we're always telling a lie. We'll go out and we'll shoot the one cheetah that's left and make it look as though there's lots of cheetahs left. And he said, and I started feeling really guilty about that and realized that we had to tell the truth. And this was his come to Jesus moment. And he took it on, hasn't made a lot of money, and he's had huge success with it. And for me, it was when Carl said he would do it that I got really hopeful.
That's great. And Bonnie, do you have a quick thing to add?
Yeah, I think for me, every time we would ask the scientists in our interviews, what can we do? Or, what gives you hope? Every one of them, even though they've committed their careers to studying climate change and know all the worst things that anyone could know about what's happening to the planet, they remained hopeful. Mm-hmm. And I'd have to say that gave me hope. The fact that these scientists in the trenches still had hope.
Yeah, it's contagious.
Yeah, great.
Well,
yeah. And that's George Woodwell said, yeah, you can't not have hope. We can't afford not to have hope.
There we go. Well, thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Bonnie and Susan, it's been such a pleasure talking to you about your film Earth Emergency, which I also just really enjoyed watching as well. The film will be available on PBS through January 28th, if anyone didn't catch it. And if you're a WGBH Passport member, it will be available in perpetuity. And you can look at the website that we posted in the chat for other ways to see this great material. Next month, Black History Month, GlobeDocs will be hosting a Black History Month film festival. So stay tuned for details on that you can find on globe.com/events. And thanks again to everyone for joining.
Thanks for having us.